One of my favorite ways to build EDH decks is to chase a particular vibe, a feeling that I want to infuse as much of as possible into the DNA of a deck. A big instance of this was chasing the feeling of raw power and inevitability granted by big lands decks, ramping myself into being the untouchable god king of a particular EDH game. However, equally alluring has been the exact opposite type of deck, a deck that can cultivate the sort of low-to-the-ground cutthroat games that often characterize other formats, but which are frequently absent in EDH. On my end of things, it's absolutely possible to play that kind of magic. I can play a combat-focused deck full of scrappy 2 and 3 drops, but the issue is that this frequently doesn't play well with the sorts of decks that dominate most of the format. Life totals are too high, ramp is too plentiful, decks are designed to get too many resources for a scrappy little pile of dudes to keep up. Aggro can work, but most often it involves either Voltron-esque methods or a strong commander such as Torbrand, Jetmir, or Animpakal as a core that binds together an otherwise disjointed game plan. That would be fine, but it wouldn't be quite the sort of Cagefight magic vision I was going for. It would be me racing a bunch of normal game plans using my powerful commander. So what if instead I went a different direction? What if I played a pile of little scrappy dudes and then dragged the rest of the table down to their level? This is where discard comes in. Discard doesn't necessarily say yes or no. Rather, it strips away resources, forcing my opponents to pick and choose what they want to keep in hand, and disproportionately hindering decks doing more synergistic or complicated things. When I first conceptualized this deck as a $25 budget deck 4 years ago, I went with a bit of an oddball commander choice. Malphagor. What's he doing here? Well, the logic is that with a 99 that is focused on flexible 2 to 3 drop creatures and 3 to 4 cost discard spells, there wasn't really a need to fit a commander into my curve, so a higher cost utility option works just fine. As for the specific appeals of Malphagor, well, I'll get back to that in a bit. When I went to finally update the 2020 version of the deck this summer, I started with a full 20 discard spells. The goal is to get the table Hellbent, and you need a lot of discard spells to do that consistently. 2 spells ends up being a good number to shoot for, and a count of 20 allows me to draw that within the first 5 draws of the game approximately 75% of the time, which is good enough for my purposes. This gave a good starting point for the deck, but simultaneously posed a problem. 20 slots is a lot to spend on a category of card that broadly doesn't directly impact the board. This brings me to a key feature of the deck, compactness. Compactness is a feature I find important in general, and on a basic level, it just means that decks should use their slots as efficiently as possible so as not to overcommit resources to accomplish tasks. In this case, the deck manages to pack decent quantities each of cards I'd consider draw spells and cards I'd consider removal spells, in addition to the discard. This compactness can be seen when I sort my categories by card type on Architect. 11 of the deck's 14 draw spells are creatures, as are 9 of its 20 discard spells and 5 of its 14 removal spells. This is critical because it allows the deck to put on pressure and keep a high creature count for purposes of cards that care about that, while still spending a full 20 slots on cards that force opponents to discard, and 14 slots each on removal and draw. My Rata deck does something similar. I cash in around 20 slots up front for ramp, and then the deck is as dense as possible with card utility from there. Specifically, these decks both place a high priority on draw and removal, running as many cards as possible that give one of these things while also serving a different purpose, such as being a beater or an acceleration spell or a land. This is not done at no cost. There are lots of cards that are quite decent generally in EDH that don't fit well into this outline. Protection spells aren't very compact because they need something to protect in order to gain value. Anthem-style cards aren't very compact because they require a board of creatures in order to gain value. Escalation cards that amplify the power of certain effects aren't very compact because they require something to amplify to gain value. And mana acceleration that is efficient but temporary isn't very compact because it requires a specific follow-up plan to gain value. None of this is to say that these cards are bad. Some of these are really fantastic alongside other cards, but that's the issue. They're not reliably helpful on their own, and the more of them you put in a deck, the more fragile it will be. Each of these decks I just mentioned mostly avoid these cards, making an exception for a small quantity of life gain, because staying alive over the course of a long game can be a challenge for a deck that is grindy and compact. With the idea of compactness in mind, let's take a look at potentially the greatest enabler of this concept in EDH, the 8th card in hand, so to speak, the commander. Malphagor is a 6-cost 6/6 flyer who discards my hand and forces each opponent to sacrifice a creature for each card discarded. This is an odd choice of commander on the surface. When we look at popular commanders for discard decks, almost all are either an enabler for making opponents discard or a payoff for making opponents discard. Like, come on, you're playing the commander format. The card that's always available to you should relate to what you're doing with your deck, right? However, Malfegor has proved to be an excellent commander choice for a few different reasons. For one, Malfegor fills a specific strategic niche here. One of the main disadvantages of running a pile of grindy creatures with discard effects and draw effects attached is that these creatures don't generally attack well into chunky mid-range boards. Malfegor serves as a solution to this issue, providing a way to blast away blockers and allow me to keep the pressure on. Malfegor's effect also pairs fantastically with discard effects. Normally, opponents might avoid overcommitting to the board if they don't have tokens to soak up some of the sacrifice triggers from Malfegor. However, with a stream of discard spells, opponents are pressured into making a terrible choice. Either keep that awesome creature in hand and risk discarding it, or play that creature and risk losing it to Malfegor. In this way, Malfegor is an example of what I'll call a counterweight commander. He subverts the weaknesses of a discard deck full of grindy creatures, thereby making the deck better rounded. Instead of doing the same thing as the deck, he does basically the opposite, and the resulting tension created by this allows for an almost call and response-esque play pattern. My board and discard spells prompt certain play patterns from my opponents, and Malfegor exists to be my follow-up to those patterns. With a commander that discards my hand on ETB, this deck naturally ended up needing to focus on another factor that's related to compactness: resilience. What this means is that a deck can recover from setbacks readily. Challenges thrown its way can be shrugged off with relative ease. This is a good deck attribute to go for in general. It creates more positive play experiences for everybody at the table when decks can recover easily from setbacks, and most of my decks feature this as a critical feature in some way or other. However, this deck takes it to a whole different level because it doesn't wait for opponents to set it back. Oh no, this deck takes a baseball bat to its own kneecaps. Of the deck's 20 discard spells, more than a third affect me as well, and as I've mentioned, the deck's commander literally makes you discard your hand. Nobody at the table is allowed to keep cards in hand, not even me. Step 1 of this deck is that we're all getting dragged down into the mud for some rough and dirty Magic the Gathering gameplay. The natural follow-up to this is that this deck is specifically engineered to be unusually good at playing under exactly those circumstances. I mentioned the deck's draw being mostly creature-based, and the other important fact about the draw suite here is that most of the draw spells are what I'd refer to as discrete engines. By discrete, I mean that these cards largely don't rely on other cards to generate card advantage, and by engine, I mean that these cards give card advantage over time. One of these requires a player to be Hellbent to be online, which is helped by playing discard spells or Malfegor, and 4 others require dealing combat damage to players, which can be assisted by removing opposing creatures. But the rest kind of just hang around and provide a stream of cards with minimal extra input required. This makes these a wonderful type of card. They're great as a top deck, they're great as a last card kept in hand while playing a big discard spell like Delirium Skeins, and most are also great to land on curve as well. The other thing that makes this deck resilient is its graveyard package. There are 5 different cards that can recur things from the graveyard, and there are also 5 cards that can be cast from the graveyard, or that can otherwise get value from being in the graveyard in some capacity. There are an additional 5 cards with Madness, and another 2 that provide benefits as a result of the deck discarding cards, and all of these components combine to allow the deck to somewhat mitigate the downsides of discarding large quantities of cards. Not fully mitigate, mind you, the deck still gets to a Hellbent state and feels it, but it has at least some tools to allow it to play through that Hellbent state better than a lot of decks can. In addition, an unexpected feature of the deck has been that discarding one's hand isn't entirely a bad thing. See, Malfegor's 1-with-nothing ETB also has a social benefit. The deck's early turns are often spent stripping away opposing hands, and this is a frustrating experience for my opponents, an experience that is only amplified when Malfegor comes down to demolish some creatures as well. Looking at the person who cleared out your hand and killed your creatures would be pretty upsetting if they still had a full grip of cards, and they'd be a magnet for attacks and removal. However, if they're also Hellbent and have a board entirely consisting of a 6/6 flyer and some utility 3/3s, well, things aren't as clear. I've frequently gotten a visceral sense of mixed feelings from my opponents while playing this deck. My opponents wish I was the unambiguous threat so they could have a good excuse to attack me, but I'm often barely ahead at all, and sometimes it's entirely unclear to my opponents who is ahead. The threat profile of a low-slung, grindy deck is just not one most EDH players are used to needing to consider. What do you do with a player who isn't an imminent threat to your life total, isn't setting up for a combo, and isn't scaling up to an overwhelming late game? The deck is perfectly capable of winning games through a mixture of attrition and beatdown, but it manages to fly under the radar much more than you'd expect, even after doing a bunch of nasty stuff to its opponents. In this way, Malfegor is critical to the deck for vibes reasons. He is the key to turning games from an epic wizard duel into a knife fight being fought in 4-inch deep mud, for myself and my opponents alike. Speaking of vibes, let's talk about one of the oddest conclusions of the deck building process. One of the exciting things about upgrading this deck over the summer was that I could finally play with Waste Not, since the previous version of the deck was an ultra budget list, and since there was now an Enchanting Tales reprint that was both cheap and super cool looking. I'm playing a discard deck, so a card that gives me various assorted benefits when opponents discard is a perfect fit, right? However, one of the first games I played with the deck was an utterly disgusting game for the card. Turn 2 Waste Not, turn 3 Arterial Flow, and continuing onward and upward from there. It felt great from a power level perspective. The deck was keeping a pretty full grip and accelerating forward in its game plan, even as the rest of the table was struggling to keep up under the weight of its discard. But something also felt very wrong about it. After a bit of reflection, it became clear what the problem was. The whole point of the deck was to play scrappy, dragging the rest of the table down into a fight in the mud, and then being really good at winning mud fights. A big piece of what made the deck work on a vibes level was that the deck had no central engine like Waste Not. It had a bunch of little individual ones, but none of them were enough to be a load-bearing pillar for the deck's game plan. The fact that Advantage is fought for tooth and nail with a bunch of disconnected little engines is a defining feature of the deck, and it's what makes the deck so grindy and flexible. This approach contrasts with that of many EDH decks. It's quite common to feature a central engine in the command zone. The commander is the center of a synergy pillar, and it has a number of other cards that generate some form of value when played alongside it. When I go to the top commanders, around half of them follow this mold. Atraxa generates value with counters cards, Ur-Dragon with dragons, Yuriko with ninjas, Mirim also with dragons, Ishin with attack ability creatures, Jodo with legendaries. You get it. In the best cases, an engine commander is one that plays to the strengths of a card type, serving as an anchor for that type that hopefully passes the vibe check. However, not all engines pass that vibe check. One example of an engine I have mixed feelings about is Angie Falconwrath, because she doesn't really play to the strengths of Madness. She can enable them, but the design of the card is such that just chaining through a whole bunch of Madness cards while paying for a few, if any, Madness costs, and then doing graveyard shenanigans or pulling off a combo, is usually better than focusing more heavily on casting cards via Madness. You could replace the word Madness with a do-nothing mechanic called Scrungus on both Angie and the now Scrungus cards, and the playstyle of most Angie decks wouldn't change all that much. All this brings me to one of my least favorite engine commanders, and one that is very similar to Waste Not, Tergrid, God of Fright. Tergrid is, structurally speaking, a pretty conventional engine commander. Maybe a little Feast or Famine, but in a similar realm to something like Joda or Mirim. So it exists in a normal-ish plane of existence for an engine commander, but counterintuitively, this is exactly why the card is one of the most hated commanders out there. See, Tergrid is an engine that works with discard and sacrifice effects, stealing and putting into play all cards that get discarded or sacrificed by opponents. Why is this a problem? Well, fundamentally, it's due to the nature of these tools. Discard and Sacrifice both have valid places in Commander, but they're tools that should be used with a specific purpose in mind. Casual Commander is naturally going to involve a negotiation between what is fun for other people and what makes for interesting games. The comfort of other players at the table will be weighed against other factors, at least in some form. The issue with using sacrifice and discard effects as engine fodder, then, is that these unpleasant tools become frivolous and impassive, equivalent to just another filler dragon in a dragon deck. Instead of deploying these tools in a way that is targeted and strategic, the Tergrid player creates a bland engine powered entirely by the suffering of their opponents, and is encouraged to play as many edicts and discard spells as possible, rather than a number chosen to fulfill a certain strategic role. In contrast to this, my Malfegor deck's hate tools are run very intentionally, with specific goals in mind. The deck runs a bunch of discard spells because it needs to kneecap opponents in order to not fall behind in value, and it runs Malfegor in the command zone because it needs a tool to break through intimidating boards and let its small creatures connect for damage. The benefits of opponents discarding and opponents losing creatures are mostly indirect, with the deck seeing benefits to its overall strategy from these things, rather than having a bunch of cards that specifically do things when opponents lose cards and permanents. In addition, the fact that the deck also plays low to the ground means that opponents don't feel like they're being smushed into submission, while the discard player gets to do some stupid explosive bullshit. No, I don't get to play any sort of explosive mid-range magic either. That's just not the sort of commander game we're playing. Now, does this mean that my Malfegor deck isn't going to make opponents sad? Absolutely not. Discard effects, and especially discard engines like Bottomless Pit, are a form of stacks effect, and they will hinder my opponent's ability to play the game. Certainly, my goal with this deck is to change the shape and scale of the game rather than preventing my opponents from playing it. I want us all to play a scrappy top-decking cage fight of a Magic game rather than some thing where we're all stacking resources constantly and racing synergy engines. And the deck does obtain this vision some amount of the time, but the biggest weakness of the deck, in power and fun terms alike, is that certain opponents will be much less harmed by my discard spells than others. See, the power of non-random discard is inversely proportional to the number of cards in somebody's hand up until the point at which that player has been hellbent in a game. If I make a player discard a card when they are at 5 cards in hand, the quality of that card will be much lower than if I force them to discard a card at 2 cards in hand. The result of this is that if somebody lands an early value engine and is able to avoid dipping below 3 or 4 cards in hand, they're going to have a much better time than somebody who is forced to go down to 1 card in hand, or fully hellbent, even if the 2 players discarded equal numbers of cards over the course of the game. In addition, decks with graveyard synergies are going to be much better able to cope than decks without. The worst case scenario is that I basically act as a kingmaker, all but handing the win to the person who is best equipped to handle this card. It's rare that things are this dramatic, but it has happened before, and it feels pretty terrible when it does. Is this a solvable problem? Kind of. The graveyard thing is, I've gradually pumped up the number of graveyard hate cards to 5, and these have actually been shockingly smooth additions. Modern Horizons 3 contained a couple of lovely flexible options, and Immersturm Predator is another grave hate engine that has great extra utility as a board wipe resistant flying beater. The issue of draw engines is definitely a trickier one, though. The amount of enchantment hate available in Rakdos is currently pretty unimpressive, and there are also forms of draw that are harder to slow down with removal. That leaves the option of single target discard, for when one opponent still has a decent grip, but the others are puttering around with 1 or fewer cards in hand. Hymn to Tarak and Mind Twist are about as good as it gets for single target discard, but these are neither efficient in the early game nor all that great as a top deck later. The other option is Spectres, creatures that force an opponent to discard when they connect for damage, but these are also largely not powerful enough to make the cut. Hypnotic Spectre is somehow both the oldest and the most powerful of these, and it's acceptable enough to be an evergreen maybe board card, but the rest are pretty much all 4-drops I wish were 3-drops, or 3-drops that I wish were sauced up a bit with some extra stats or keywords. For the moment, I'll be keeping an eye on the problem and potentially experimenting with some of the single-target discard options that do exist, and for the future, I'll just hope that the card gods at Wizards of the Coast bless me with a new Spectre that is more prepared for the demands of 2024 Magic. Despite its challenges, this deck has been a success overall, both in terms of creating a deck on the right power level for the games I want to play, and in terms of chasing the vibe I was looking to chase. I've known for years that the Malfegor deck was my favorite of the decks from the $25 pool, with its grindy to the max gameplay leading to some really interesting games, and I'm glad to have maintained that with the upgrade. Above all else, it's an extremely fun deck. There is a calculated recklessness with every play, and it's so fun to be able to play fast and loose with both life total and cards in hand. I had a game recently where I played Malfegor, discarding my 6-card hand, then activated Spymaster's Vault to cycle through some cards and put 4 +1/+1 counters on Malfegor, then swung 15 at an opponent since I now had an Anger in my graveyard from all that discarding, and during all of this I was on 5 life with 2 Dark Confidant effects on board, threatening to end me on each of my upkeeps. I survived more than 2 full turn cycles after this, by the way. Lots of lands happened to be on top. That sort of play is, to me, the defining feature of the deck, being able to throw all caution to the wind, to commit to plays as hard as is physically possible, and to find creative ways to rebuild and come up with resources after it looks like I should be all out of gas. It's a playstyle that is antithetical to my control player roots, and even a bit antithetical to Commander as most people know it, but that's the appeal. Finding new and fresh ways to play will always be a big goal for me at EDH, as will be creating decks that evoke a highly specific feeling. And this deck is certainly one version of that. That's the end of the video, but I have a very special announcement. I recently hit 50,000 subscribers, which is super cool, and to celebrate, I'm going to be running a deck building challenge through my Discord server. Malfegor has around 300 decks on EDH Rec as of publishing this video, which is quite a small count for how cool the card is, and it occurred to me that there are a lot of other similarly underappreciated commanders out there that could use a bit more love. So, for this challenge, I picked out 5 different monocolored commanders I like that have less than 200 decks on EDH Rec. Those commanders are Eomer, Marshal of Rohan, Yomiji, who bars the way, Aegon, God of Death, Shizuko, Caller of Autumn, and Senator Peacock. To participate in this challenge, construct a deck with one of those 5 commanders, then post it in the submission thread in my Discord server within 1 week of this video's upload. So, to be clear, that deadline will be Tuesday the 30th at 9 AM PST. Judging criteria will be creativity, cohesiveness, and likelihood to create dynamic gameplay. Any power level, any budget. My next video will feature a deck me and my team determine best fits the prompt for each of these 5 commanders, so you can keep an eye out for that, regardless of whether you want to participate. With that said, thanks for watching, and if you want to support me in doing what I do, a link to my Patreon is down in the description. If you want more snail and don't want to give me money, I was on an episode of the Magic Mirror podcast this week, and me and my co-hosts ranked each other's most played decks. It was a lot of fun, and quite interesting to see how my main 6 decks stacked up in other people's eyes. A link to that is down in the description. Alright, that's all. Bye now.